In this lecture, the third lecture of week 1, I want to expand upon two sets of ideas about justice that you may have noticed in your reading of the Santa Cruz Declaration on the Global Water Crisis. The first set explores justice and the uses of water. In other words, how may justice and injustice differ as we focus on water for agriculture, water for industry, water for cities, and other large social uses of water. The second set of ideas of social justice distinguish between distributive goals and procedural processes of justice, and begin to let us think about ideas of justice as recognition and participation raised in the Declaration. These ideas can build upon the approach to justice of Amartya Sen and Mahbub ul Haq. The exploration of social justice in relation to broad ideas of social uses of water, such as agriculture and industry, can be well grounded in the goals of people struggling for lives that they have reason to value. Then the dimensions of distributive and procedural participation and recognition come to life when they engage with lives and struggles of tangible people. Again, Sen's and Huck's framework of capabilities and freedoms provides ways to ground social justice in each of these dimensions. Water use and justice I want to talk about first. There are striking differences between social relationships and justice concerns in relation to the use of water in industry, agriculture, cities, and more. We will be taking these questions further in subsequent weeks. Here I want to describe the social context of these uses so that I can explain how water justice takes a different form in each case. Water is needed for growing all crops. If rainfall is insufficient, as it is in many places across the world, then human ingenuity is required to deliver water to crops. This water is termed irrigation. As you will be aware, there are many technologies to deliver water to farmland. And behind the implementation and operation of those technologies, there are social relations and political conflict. Those technologies often matter, contribute to the making of inequality and injustice. So does the nature of social change in agriculture. We will get back to this topic in more detail in a later week. Here I want to describe some elements of water injustice in agriculture. The ability to control water for crops is a central element in social change. At its simplest, those with water can produce more crops and some may get rich, while those who cannot may find their ability to grow crops declining. So irrigation water is a significant element in the divisions of society. Some get rich while others get poor. In other words, access to and control over irrigation water is central to the making of rich and poor. This is particularly noticeable in those countries of the Global South where a large part of the population is employed on the land. In industrialized countries like the US, only a small proportion, in the range 2 to 4%, is so employed. On irrigation, the Declaration is describing the issues that arise around water for agriculture. Sometimes there are established traditions and even plural sets of laws in peasant and indigenous societies. These can be suppressed by the way that governments exert their power and the power of large landowners. Also, the apolitical, technical language of new irrigation schemes can overlook existing traditions and processes of sharing. So there's an issue of water justice and agriculture there. In cities, issues of water justice are not so much about sharing water, the central question in agriculture. Urban water justice considers who can get access to water, whether it carries waterborne disease, if it is sufficient for all household purposes, and with what difficulties of distance, dignity, and price is it collected. Here the declaration is describing the striking inequalities of access to water and sanitation in cities, particularly in the global south. Almost all such cities have large shanty towns and other unauthorized settlements. Generally, these are referred to as informal settlements. In an earlier time, they were termed slums. We will be discussing these questions more in future weeks, and particularly in the week on urban water and sanitation justice. The declaration also discusses the issue of water injustice arising in mining oil and valuable minerals, often in forests and indigenous areas, and the water injustices associated with a wave of land grabbing in Africa. Here, foreign companies, particularly from China, but also from Europe, have begun to buy up land in order to practice large-scale industrial farming. Here too, significant water issues arise. If we go back to the slide I showed you in Lecture 1 on the global consumption of water for different uses, we see that urban industrial uses take a larger proportion of water consumption when societies become developed or industrialized. For industry, water was a key element of early industrialization. It provided motive power through water wheels for textile mills and other early industries. In the Santa Cruz Declaration, we encounter several other issues of water justice related to these water issues of mining, land grabbing, and international water disputes. Each raises a somewhat different set of justice issues. In Latin America, for example, there are many struggles, particularly of indigenous peoples, against the use and pollution of water for mineral extraction. Periodically, disputes over the sharing and development of international rivers rises to be global news. Way back, I wrote a book about the sharing of the river Ganges in South Asia between India, Bangladesh, and Nepal. Several river questions around the rivers of the Himalayas involving those three countries and China and others continue. But in this class, we will not spend too much time on international water disputes. If you're strongly interested in this issue, send me an email and we can talk more. The second set of ideas help us break down several dimensions of social justice. They concern the outcomes, elements, and procedures of justice. The first two concern straightforward ideas: distributive justice and procedural justice. Distributive justice asks who gets what and how much do they get. This is most simply illustrated by looking at water for irrigation in dry countries and dry seasons. As I mentioned earlier, those who get water may get rich, and those who do not may stay poor. So in this case, what do you think? What is fair, equitable, or just? Should all farmers get water? Should they get the same amount of water, or enough water to cover the land that they cultivate? Should they get enough water to grow water-intensive crops like rice or almond trees? Those are questions of distributive justice. That leads straightforwardly into questions of procedural justice. Who decides and how? what social and political practices lead to the allocation of water. I want you to watch a short clip of video. It's from an interview I recorded with Peter Mollinger. He's a professor of development studies at London University who has undertaken long-term detailed research into a huge canal system in southern India called the Tungabhadra Canal System. I asked Peter Mollinger to illustrate distributive and procedural justice in the context of this canal system. Could you provide an example from your work on the canal irrigation system in South India of how procedural and distributive justice are different and how they operate?
Yes. Well, my simplest explanation of the difference between two types of justice, or two elements of justice, is probably more correct. Procedural and distributive is the distributive justice is, I think, is defined in terms of outcomes. Who gets how much? The head-enders and the tail-enders problem of unequal distribution, which is manifest in most irrigation systems in the world to some degree. Who gets more and who gets less? That's, in water terms, that's a very straightforward kind of manifestation of distributive injustice or justice, and there can be degrees of that. Procedural justice in that sense is about who has voice in the process of that production of that inequality or efforts to do something about it. Is everyone entitled to sit on the Water Users Committee? I mean, in the state of Andhra Pradesh where I've worked, the irrigation reform of the late 1990s first had in its act that only landowners could be members of water users associations. So they had voice, in principle have voice in the deliberation at that local level on the rules for distribution and all the other things. As it happened, many actual water users were not landowners, but were actually sharecroppers or tenants or not the formally registered landowners. And they also, there were water users, even in the irrigation system, which were not irrigators, but which used water for other purposes. So there was a whole discussion about who is entitled to be part of the deliberation of local water management. And that is about procedural justice. It's one element of procedural justice, so having the right to voice. And then, of course, it is about the conduct of that process. Because you can say everybody has voice, but if some people are more powerful than others for other reasons, then the voice, even when you're part of the process, your voice may not be equally appreciated or present. So there are many more aspects to procedural justice, but either in gender terms or in class terms again, but I mean that I think illustrates the point already. Yeah.
So Mollinger says distributive justice is about outcomes, who gets more water and who gets less. He mentions a tail-ender and head-ender problem having influence on how much water people get in all irrigation systems. Canals carry water downhill. At the start of the canal, the header end, there is lots of water. At the bottom or tail end of the canal, there is much less water. Farmers down the length of the canal have taken out water. So those farmers at the head end of the system can take more water, and those at the tail end tend to be left with much less. What Mollinger has found in his research is that certain groups of farmers have managed to get land at the head of the canal. They grow water-intensive crops like sugar and rice, and they become rich. Those further down the canal can only get much less water, and their chances of getting rich are then minimal. So these are questions of distributive justice. How does this happen? Many social processes around land, wealth and power are at work. From the perspective of water, what are the procedures? Here Mollinger concentrates on who has voice, who sits on committees deciding the allocation of irrigation water. He describes the example of local water users associations that are limited only to landowners. But many users do not own land, and many use water for other purposes. If all have a place at the table, some are heard and others are not. These are questions of procedural justice. Questions of social justice and water justice arise in relation to other elements of justice mentioned in the Declaration, notably recognition and participation. These questions will be taken up throughout the class, most immediately next week. I want to talk briefly about environmental justice and varieties of environmentalism. The Santa Cruz Declaration can be seen as a statement about environmental justice. It's about water and justice, after all. This is reasonable, and we will be referring to environmental justice in several upcoming weeks. Before we go further, I want to say a couple of words about different traditions of environmental justice. One rooted in the United States and the industrialized world, the other arising in the global south, the developing countries, emerging countries, and industrializing world. An environmental historian, Ramachandra Guha, and an economist, Juan Martinez Allier, summarize the difference between these two traditions as full stomach versus empty belly environmentalism. The first refers to the global north and the second to the global south. The view from the south, empty belly environmentalism, builds on the perceptions and valuations of nature of subordinate groups, peasants, fisherfolk, landless labourers. It focuses particularly on poverty and originates in social conflicts over access to and control over natural resources. A whole range of justice questions are questioned around forest, water and energy. Often the rural poor try to retain control of forest and water resources against state takeover, mining or the advance of capitalism. In the North, these two writers use full-belly environmentalism to describe concerns particularly of wilderness and conservation. These concerns, they argue, are quite different from those of movements of the poor in the global south. And then we can recognize a separate third tradition of environmental justice that is organized particularly around the concentration of toxic wastes and deprivation facing minority communities. We will be referring to these traditions in several places in the class. Environmental justice in the US and the North, and environmental movements in the global South. Now you get to watch a video before opening the next reading. It's made by an environmental justice coalition about the human right to water in poor towns and rural communities in California. In this video, you will see that many towns and communities in California suffer a range of water injustices. This question is considered in more detail in the week on water justice in the global North and global South. Now that you have watched that video, I want you to begin to read the third reading for this week on defining and researching struggles for water justice. Margaret Zwarteveen and Rutger Bolens are professors in the Netherlands who have long histories of research on a range of water justice questions all across the world. They wrote this paper in the wake of the Equitable Governance of Water conference at UC Santa Cruz in 2013. And they are also two of the authors of the Santa Cruz Declaration coming out of that conference. The paper they wrote is insightful, probably the best overview of water justice and struggles for water justice. But it is hard work to read. It is full of interesting and pertinent ideas. It is, however, dense. In the next lecture, I will bring out and illustrate what seem to me key elements of the paper. As with any academic paper, I recommend that you read the beginning and the end before tackling the stuff in the middle. What is the main argument? You can get that from the abstract. It aims to provide a framework for understanding water problems as problems of justice. So it's important to this course. What are the main section headings? When I am making notes on a significant academic paper, I start by listing the main headings in the paper. That gives me an overview of the content and doesn't take too much intellectual effort. With that, I can decide which sections I want to read. And when I'm making notes on such a paper, I use a bibliographic application so that I can keep my notes all in one place. There are several free applications. Zotero is one that many people use, and Colweeze is another. Maybe you too want to keep all your notes on readings in one place. Take a look at Zotero or Colweeze. Early on in the paper, you can see that it is taking up issues we have come across earlier this week. The paper is building on the idea that we saw in the Santa Cruz Declaration that global water crises arise more from injustice than directly from scarcity of water. It is also taking for granted the idea from Sen and Huck that justice should be rooted in people's lives rather than in abstract and universal conceptions of fairness and justice. So I want you to take a look at that paper next.